rubrics. So, welcome and good afternoon. Thank you for coming today to this event co-organized with the Institut Montaigne. It's my pleasure to welcome in particular Nicolas Bouquet, who's the research director at the Institut Montaigne, and to welcome the authors of a study that the Institut Montaigne together with Terra Nova just published, which is called Saving the Right to Asylum. So I think the plan of today is that we will first hear a presentation of the study by the two authors or principal authors, followed by a discussion where Karen Metz from Save the Children International will give comments to the authors. We had one more discussant from the European Commission who unfortunately called me yesterday because he was sick, so I apologize that we don't have the EU institutions represented, but I'm sure that you in the audience will add questions, remarks, so that this will be a rich and lively debate today. So thank you again for coming, and a very warm welcome again to Institut Montaigne. And Nicolas, let me give the floor to you.
Thank you, Guntram. Hello to all of you. I'm Nicolas Bouquet from Institut Montaigne. We are very happy to be here in Brussels. That's our first event to be part of the debate here in Brussels. We are very happy to organize it with Bruegel. We think, as a French think tank, it's a responsibility also to come here and to share with us some of the proposals we are making for policy making. That's what we do, especially when it regards important issues and policies at the European level. And I'm very proud to do that for this first time on this topic of migration and asylum, because it's a very important issue of a special responsibility, and it was a very special project that we had with Terra Nova. We thought that it is not a topic where we should score any kind of points, but where we have really to collaborate together to achieve responsible and useful solutions to the problems we are facing up to our historical responsibilities. So in March, we started this working group with Terra Nova and Institut Montaigne to work out some solutions. We published the report in October, and here we are in Brussels, happy to share it with you and to have your comments, because that's really the point, to have your comments, how you receive these proposals, and how we can together go forward. We start with Brussels. We will then go on March 21 in Berlin. We are planning to go in Italy, in Spain, other countries. So we really want to be part of this European debate. It's very timely. Our president has just published a letter written to all of you, all of us, Europeans. And then at the think tank, we are happy to be part of this European conversation. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Yes, it's afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to be so many present. Just a word of introduction. I'm Jean-Paul Thiet. I'm now a lawyer. I used to be an official. I used to work 4 years in the Berlaymont. It was a couple of decades ago. And now one of the members of Institut Montaigne sometimes asked to work on EU problems or EU solutions. We can make it short, considering that you all had the opportunity to read the report. If not, please do. Just a remark. Usually there is a summary of proposals of Institut Montaigne that is joined with the document. It seems to be missing right now, but it's very easy to have it from the Institut Montaigne website. To make it short, and we will share the presentation with Marc-Olivier. A couple of points. First of all, the right of asylum, as everybody knows now, is now in the Geneva Convention and conventions for application, but it is also, and there are often some journalists that do not know that. This is also a great part of the European treaties. And just to quote a couple of sentences, the asylum policy is considered a shared policy in the Lisbon Treaty, consistent with the Geneva Convention, and based on the solidarity of member states. I think that some of us sometimes forget that, and it is a pity just to have to recall that, which are the basics of the values that are in our treaty. Now, coming to the main proposal of this report, I think that the first one was to request to transform national authorities in charge of asylum policy in independent administrative authorities. We consider that asylum is a right. It is a right that is granted by international convention, that is guaranteed by EU treaties, and this is not a question of policy that should be left in the hands of the politicians. This is the reason why we are really asking for every administration in charge of asylum to be independent from the politician forces. The second important proposal is also to have a real European asylum agency. We are not talking about a completely centralized process where everybody will have to file in Brussels and everything will be decided here, but with a coordination agency that will, of course, coordinate the independent national authorities and make sure that the criteria applied are the same, that the policies are aligned, and that problems arising in a country can be solved together. The third of our proposal, which is probably the most debated, is to renounce to the country of first entry rule, the so-called Dublin rule or the Dublin system. We consider that it is important to change it because it is a complete failure. You know that some of you know, have learned, or some of you have experienced, that when we put this rule into force, it was just to ensure that countries situated at the external frontiers of borders of the EU should strengthen their control. But it is a failure. We have to admit that. According to specialists, the number of registration in Italy is about 60 to 65%. The number of registration in Greece is probably less. And then this effort to strengthen the external border was a failure. More important for us, this system was supposed to forbid multiple requests of asylum to different countries. But it didn't work. You know, multiple requests are still possible. The only condition is that you have to wait between about 18 months without being controlled by any administration or any police force, and then you are entitled to apply to another country, which is completely a nonsense. And the third important reason why we consider this rule should be changed is because it is a kind of encouragement to clandestinity. Because, of course, there are a lot of illegal migrants that are trying to apply through an application for asylum, and then that try to stay just under the radars, to stay and to go from a country to another. So at the end of the day, we don't see any sensible reason to keep this system. And then we consider that the first point should be to allow asylum seeker to express a wish, considering the country where they will be received, and then to have this European asylum making, of course, a kind of perequation and a kind of a system based on EU member states' solidarity. That's for the first part of the proposal, and if you allow me, I will give the floor to Marc-Olivier to comment on the others.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much. I was not directly involved in the group working on this field, but as a director of studies of Terra Nova, I'm happy to discuss this matter with you. So I will just develop 4 points. The first one is the readmission agreements. The second one deals with countries of transit. The third one is to facilitate integration. And the last point, which is quite important, is our proposal to create European receiving and processing centers in the countries on the border of the Mediterranean Sea. So the first point is that if we have, as Jean-Paul said, European procedures with this new agency, we should have also European procedures for the removal of rejected applicants. So we should give to the Union the task of negotiating readmission agreements with countries of origins, which is heading to a new EU migration diplomacy on which we will try to work in a next common working group. The second point is that we should also have a policy towards transit countries where the situation of migrants is very harsh, to say the least. And so to ensure that they receive migrants in a way that respects human dignity, which is definitely not the case in many countries today, although, and especially in countries with which we have agreements. So respect human dignity. This means provide them training and orientation programs, aid for their return, and make asylum seekers' path to Europe safer, with in work together with the UNHCR. But in no circumstances should these countries of transit be tasked with handling asylum applications on behalf of member states. This is our duty to process with the request. So we do not recommend, of course, any outsourcing or externalization of our duty of international protection. And in no way should the EU financially support countries that receive migrants in conditions that are not respectful of their human dignity. The third point is that we should have programs to facilitate integration of asylum seekers, give them additional civil and social rights, like access to the labor market in a shorter period of time. In France, for example, they have to wait quite long, whereas in Germany it's quite shorter. And of course, the main goal is to facilitate their integration and to welcome them well. And the first point, the last point, is maybe the most important, is to create European receiving and processing centers in EU countries having in a Mediterranean coast, which implies, by the way, France, naturally. And this is a huge challenge for France. So how would that work? The situation would be that, as today, asylum seekers, as in the best case, rescued at sea, and they are brought, because of the maritime law, to the nearest coast, and there they are received in centers where they can apply and request asylum in the member state of their choice. And of course, so the member state of their choice is not necessarily the one where they landed, and therefore that's why we shift from the Dublin system of today. And then the European agency we talked about would have the responsibility to equalize the requests and to share the burden of distributing refugees among member states. Then member states will open offices within the centers and send agents who will be tasked with processing applications in less than 1 month, so that it's manageable. And fourth, those asylum seekers who receive protection are transferred to the member states that has granted it. So that's for the whole, the general idea. Of course, we can discuss that further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marc-Olivier and Jean-Paul. And then Karen has kindly agreed to give the comments on the report, and then we can open it to questions. Maybe we'll start with a little discussion, and then I really welcome you to ask questions, because it's a fantastic report in a sense that it gives research and fact-based information about the asylum process, which is oftentimes is rare in the debate, not only journalists, but even among the policymakers. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity to ask very specific questions.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm Karen. I work for Save the Children, so I'm a bit of an outlier here as I work for civil society. We've been a key responder also in the so-called, is this working okay? Yeah. Yes, in the so-called refugee crisis. A first caveat that I wanted to make when I saw the title of the report is that it says saving the right to asylum, and I think we should really talk about saving the right to asylum in the EU. Because if you go to member states and you say, you know, we need to save the right to asylum, they will say, for sure, we will help you save the right to asylum in Uganda, in Lebanon, in Jordan, as long as it's not in the EU. So I think we need to be really clear in making the case for the right to asylum in the EU. Then as a responder, I can tell you a little bit of our experience on the ground, because we used to operate a search and rescue ship, which a few years ago, if I may remind you, was really welcomed, and we did that at the initiative of the Italian Coast Guard. Of course, the atmosphere turned sour quite quickly. Now there's almost no NGOs operating search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean, and I was just talking to my Italian colleague the other day, and she said, well, nobody is arriving. Where are they? Certainly not applying for asylum in the EU. Another case where we've seen really an active policy to limit access to asylum was, of course, in Greece. We saw the implementation of the EU-Turkey deal. We saw the introduction of admissibility criteria, which introduced a huge backlog of asylum claims, and tens of thousands of people stuck on the islands, nowhere to go. There's a few other examples of how the right to asylum was limited there. You have the admissibility, which afterwards, if you look at it, didn't seem to be the most effective policy. But you also have limitations to the right to family reunification under Dublin. There was a deal between Greece and Germany where family reunification was halted, and there was also some tapering with vulnerability criteria in Greece. And vulnerability is an important tool for migration management, and I think we need to keep our eyes open for that. Because there's a list, when you're on the islands, the Greek government has a list of vulnerability criteria, and if you're deemed vulnerable, then you can be transferred to the mainland and you can access your legitimate right to asylum. And there's been a continuous political pressure to influence that vulnerability list and to also influence the establishment, how the appeals committees in Greece were operating. So this is why I actually welcome, when I read the report, the establishment of independent asylum agencies in the countries, because we've seen a lot of interference from the political side, and also at the very technical level when we're talking about Dublin transfers, kind of introducing new security measures that make Dublin transfers much lower, etc. So I think there, an independent national asylum agency would make a lot of sense. Of course, where we've also seen a limitation to the right to asylum is at the overall European policy level. Fewer and fewer people do actually get refugee status, like full-blown refugee status. In the report, you don't make a distinction between refugee status and subsidiary protection, but it does in some countries limit your access to certain rights. In Sweden, if you have subsidiary protection, you're not entitled to family reunification, for instance. We see the introduction of the border procedure in both the Return Directive and the Asylum Procedures Regulation, where it's very clear that they want to limit the amount of, they want to contain and limit the amount of arrivals to the EU. And there's in the current Return Directive that's on the table, there's a definition of the risk of absconding, which is so broad that it includes all irregular migrants arriving to the EU. So once they arrive, they can be immediately contained and, if necessary, indefinitely or be sent back. One other thing that I think we need to really closely watch is how the European budget negotiations will proceed, because a lot of the proposals in the report also talk about strengthening asylum systems, strengthening these European processing centers that need to be funded by the EU. But one of the central discussions on the current Asylum and Migration Fund, which was previously the AMIF, is on whether this fund could be spent entirely externally or within the EU. So there's a lot of discussion, even for such a strong domestic fund, on spending it externally. And if you look at the combination of how much money will be spent on strengthening asylum systems outside of the EU, it is quite concerning. Regarding the report, I think there were a lot of valuable proposals in there, and some of the proposals I've already seen in some of the Parliament reports. I know, for instance, Ellie Schlein, as an MEP and a shadow rapporteur on Dublin, was a fierce advocate for abandoning the country of first entry criterion, and a light version of that was included in the current Dublin proposal. There was also a proposal on making sure labour market access is available within 3 months. In the current Reception Conditions Directive, Rapporteur Sophie Infeld included a 2-month limit between applying for asylum and accessing the labour market. Of course, as we know, the asylum package currently is going nowhere, and it remains to be seen what happens when a new commission is in place. Some of the proposals, and I may be a little more critical here, I think we need to be mindful of the political space that we're operating in. I'm a Belgian. Our government fell over the migration compact. So I think we need to also be a bit realistic. I feel like actively calling for more Europeanization or like a European agency for asylum, giving the free choice to refugees, while we can all agree that this is completely reasonable, I feel like the political space for these kind of proposals might be a bit limited. What I did really like, and where I personally think we can make progress, just also where I see we can make progress from an advocacy perspective, is when we take incremental steps. So if we look at the processing centers, for instance, you also suggested working with pilots, where you pilot here and there, and then you connect to pilots, and then you show that it works, and then all these little pilots can be connected into a system. I feel like we need to show that it works slowly from the bottom up, and then we can achieve a systematic change at a higher level. This is also where I see movement. I see movement with municipalities and communities working together, regions working together, universities working together, as long as it steers away from that toxic, contentious political level that we see right now. So I think overall I would really support many of the proposals that are in there, but I also really think we need to be strategic about how we approach this given the current political context.
Thank you very much, Karen. And maybe if I can open with the first question, sort of you could give a segue into that question. On the political reception of your findings and also your recommendations, is there agreement that the Dublin process needs to be changed, that the first entry needs to be changed? And if there is such an agreement, politically, what would be the acceptable solutions? in Marc-Olivier or Jean-Paul?
No, I can make a comment on that. First of all, thank you for the suggestions for us to be more precise and say about the right to asylum in the EU. It was so obvious to us that we didn't even think about that, but of course it's a good point. Regarding the rule of first entry, the country of first entry, I must say that when you talk face-to-face, bilaterally, even with politicians, with persons that are aware of the problem, most of them agree that this rule is a complete failing and that it has to be changed. But when we come to, I would say, official circles, and even when we discuss with the services of the Commission, they told us, it's too early to propose something like that. We know that it was not functioning. We are not prepared to table kind of renouncement to this rule and to put something else. Now, coming to something else, I mean, we don't think that the last word should be left to the asylum seekers. They have just to express a wish, and after that, of course, there will be a kind of perequation system, because there is this necessity of solidarity between member states, and this is something to be, of course, managed at the level of the European agency, I think. But please, Marc-Olivier, if you want to
I just
comment.
will add a small word to say on the political opportunity to change the Dublin system. Some people could say, well, at least the wave of migration has come down, so the political pressure is not so high at the moment. But that would be an illusion to think that, because probably there will be other waves, and political decisions will be have to be made, and in a context of a very high pressure, which is not a good context to take new political decisions. So we should anticipate, I think, this problem and go ahead before.
Thank you. And Marc-Olivier mentioned that the pressure has come down because the arrivals have subsided, but at what cost in terms of the European values, but also, as the report and you have discussed, the legality of some of those agreements, for example, given the French constitution. Could you elaborate on that? Because to me that was not clear before, the full legal aspects of it.
But on the legal aspect, it's more...
No, I can, yeah, on the legal aspect, there is a clear constitutional rule that is prohibiting, at least in France, the externalization of the process of providing asylum. This rule has been adapted within the EU by a special reform of our constitution, and we accepted the Dublin system because of a change in our constitution. There is no way to accept that asylum seekers be treated in Turkey, in Libya, or in other countries. This is our role, this is our rules, and this is our duty. That's clearly something that can be negotiated. After that, yes, the number of seekers sharply decreased. At what cost, first of all? Even financially. You know that it's already 3 billion given to Turkey. Another 3 billion is just being discussed. It's a lot of money, but also this will have an end. You know, we don't have precise figures, but we estimate that there are about 2.5 million of persons in Turkey coming from the countries where there was war. Are they all asylum seekers? I don't know, because it is, of course, a case-by-case decision. But if who can consider that Turkey can just receive 1 or 2 million more? No, it's not completely impossible. And at what cost should we renounce to our rights and to our value just to save a system that just needs to be amended?
And Marc-Olivier, this lower numbers now have given the politicians a breathing room, and they appear to be happy, content with that. So is there risk of more of these deals emerging, or maybe at sort of targeting other aspects of asylum process? Or migration as well. I know we're focusing just on asylum, but...
I think that, well, Jean-Paul talked about the deal we have with Turkey, which is questionable on moral standards, but the situation is even worse with Libya, of course, because we don't have a proper deal with Libya, but we just close our eyes and we know that the situation is very harmful for the migrants in Libya, and so I don't think that we can still handle this situation, this very ambiguous situation with Libya.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the Libya situation? Is it the bilateral deals with the specific groups, part of the forces in Libya? I mean, because it's very opaque in the general public debate.
As far as I know, I don't know, maybe Jean-Paul knows more, but Italy negotiated with Libya directly, at least with one of the power in Libya, and probably also directly with groups. And so we have this problem with smuggling groups that are, in a way, financed probably. So we cannot go on with the situation.
Karen,
yes.
Maybe you want to comment something from the practical aspects you meet in your work from these deals.
Yes, well, the thing is, what you're saying is right. We cannot really externalize asylum claims in the sense that it's impossible for a member state to go externally and establish an asylum system there for that member state. But what we can do is pursue what I call the Agadas model, which is what we see in Niger, where people are arriving in a center and you have IOM and UNHCR working together. Frontex has now an external mandate. EASO's mandate is going to be expanded externally, where they kind of say, okay, these people need to be sent back to their countries of origin, and these people can apply for resettlement, and then we can see where these pledges lead to. In terms of deals, there's been, because Europe used such an interest-focused approach, it has not always worked. Countries like Senegal and Mali and Tunisia have been resisting these deals, but we cannot deny that we see some movement between Morocco and Spain. We see, indeed, that Italy has an MOU with Libya and Libyan forces. We see Niger complying, and Niger is really working also, it's very cooperative, also because they don't have a large diaspora, because a lot of people in Niger are too poor to migrate. And we see, what I find very concerning, what we need to keep an eye on, increased cooperation with countries like Sudan, which is really developing. So there are some spaces in which they will try to put this model forward, I think.
I think we agree on that, and most of our countries are already working with HCR just to put some kind of, I would say, special gate to look at the request and then express a first view. But at the end of the day, it is for the country to make the final decision. And I think it works. It works in some countries. We can, of course, this is not externalization. That's a process that is working with the HCR. But maybe just a final comment about what you see. Should we be so politically reasonable? That's a good question. That's a good question. I think every think tank should ask this question, which is very important. We're not elected. We have time, and we are able to provide some suggestions that probably politicians can do. And that's one of our forces, just to look, probably to have a longer view and to say, look, this system cannot work anymore. Maybe it can work 3, 4, 5 years, which is the duration of a political mandate. But we are just thinking about what should happen in 10, 20 years ahead. And that, I think, Marc-Olivier can comment on the name of Terra Nova, but I think for Montaigne it is very important to say that we are looking for the future, really.
And just even
and for probably Bruegel too. But
and just even for the near future, we all talk about from the macro point of view about the upcoming potential crisis in Turkey from the macroeconomic point of view was the tightening of the Fed and the ECB, and that is country is already on the brink of macroeconomic collapse. So 3 billion is not going to make a big difference for that in the next couple of years, and there is of course a risk of restart of the arrivals. Of course, we discussed that it's very important to make a special distinction of asylum seekers versus a broader migration flows. But you also raised an interesting point in your report where you have some people who used to have normally access to the temporary labor market or maybe longer labor market in Europe, and they come because maybe there are push, but also there are pull factors from the macroeconomic point of view. Those permits have dropped significantly, and you are saying that some of those people are opportunistically using the asylum process. So rather than further tightening on the labor market access for some of these people, would you suggest that maybe again giving more of the temporary work visas where people come for an employment opportunity and remove illegality from the aspect?
Difficult question, because we are working on this subject with Terra Nova and Institut Montaigne on a more general migration report that will be published probably at the end of the current year. Now, why did we separate asylum, the asylum question? First of all, as I already said, because it's a right. It should be regulated by the rule of law, but not by a politician's choice. But you're right in saying that one of the reasons why there are so many asylum seekers and so many applications rejected is because we tried to close the door in many, many countries, and we tried to put an end to a kind of migration, labor migration, family migration, etc. That is now in many, many countries, almost all of our countries, prohibited. And now, of course, what are doing the candidates for kind of legal migration? Of course, they are applying through the asylum gate, just because it provides them with 3 to 9 months right to stay, and then they can just try to escape from any control or try to adapt, integrate. It's really a practical problem. That's the reason why we think that our next step will be to think about migration policy. But one of our motto, of course, will be this should be an EU migration policy, not a policy where every country is doing what it wants within its borders, which is a policy for the past, not for the future.
And maybe I'll allow myself one last question to the panelists, and then we'll open to the floor. On the specific issue of the Mediterranean region, originally maybe the first point of entry was to incentivize them to control their borders better. Is that true in your view? And also, what is the role of Frontex now? How that has changed? If you could comment on that. Do we need a special deal for Mediterranean? And how is this trade-off, first point of entry versus border control, how is that has evolved? If whoever wants to start first.
Yes, the European strategy was to say that to put pressure on countries on the Mediterranean border, especially Greece and Italy, to push them to control their borders better. When you discuss with officials, at least in France, they always say if we lower the pressure, they won't control their borders well, and they're not doing enough, at least today. So we should really keep this direction. But that was quite unfair, in fact, because especially with Italy and Greece, because the situation was really unpredictable and completely new. And at that time, we didn't help them properly to face the new situation. And so they have good reasons to protest and say that they didn't receive the support they were expecting from the European solidarity. So it's the whole situation gets back to the first point, is that it doesn't work today, the Dublin system. So, but what we wanted to do is to propose a system that doesn't imply sovereignty transfer. Each country stays with its own sovereign entitlements to, especially, of course, the borders, and also the duty of international protection, which is not transferred to the European level, but stays in each country.
Yeah. And how does that work exactly? Frontex, the responsibility of Frontex versus the national responsibilities.
Frontex is supposed to be here to help the national authorities and the national forces. I don't have the exact figure in mind, but I think that Frontex agents are less than 500. So they have to rely to the country forces, to the border police of the national border police and national border forces, and just to cooperate. But without renouncing to sovereignty, what we have to go is in the direction of a kind of sharing of sovereignty, that is discussing of what rules should we apply, how can we apply them, what migration policy should we put in place, and after that it should be, of course, managed by the national authority, but taking into account the common objectives. Otherwise it will not work. And in such a system, I think that reinforce Frontex would be very helpful. I mean, reinforce up to 10,000 people, probably, just to provide a real help in these countries where, of course, it is much more difficult to control the borders than it will be the case in Luxembourg. We just should be aware of that.
Yes, well, I think that we do need to recognize that the borders of Spain and Greece and Italy are our borders, that there are joint common borders, and I do see a role for Frontex there, but I also want to have a bit of a reality check here, because, as you said, Frontex doesn't have a lot of staff. And while member states keep shouting that they need to protect our borders, we need to better protect our borders, but there is no border staff. Like, where are they going to get this border staff? National countries, firstly, they don't have the right amount of equipped and trained border staff. And secondly, a lot of these people don't want to go to Italy, Greece, or Spain to work there. So we saw this in the hotspots as well. Frontex made repeated pledges to ask, we need more people deployed from the member states in the hotspots, but these pledges weren't fulfilled, and the same for the European Asylum Agency. So while I see in theory also from member states a commitment, in exchange for Italy, Greece, and Spain managing their borders better, that they would finance that they would commit staff to that, I am still waiting to see how this will play out, because it's very shiny to say 10,000 new staff, but we will really have to see how this will work in reality. And as far as the Mediterranean system is concerned, I also think it's double, because we want a solution now because the problem is there now. And we see that the Dublin negotiations are in a deadlock. So I do think that, like I said, incremental steps could be good, establishing pilot centers, trying to see how it works with a few countries relocating, etc. But we need to make sure that we keep our eyes also on a more structural reform of the system, and that we don't forget that is also needed. Yeah.
Thank you. So, yes, I would like to open the floor to questions. Please do raise a hand. And we can spend here the rest of the afternoon, I think, on this topic. Hopefully we solve it.
Yes. Hello, my name is Martin. I'm with the Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten. Just one of the main issues here is, of course, still to achieve some kind of more solidarity among member states. So could you because we've been locked in that position for several years now, so maybe could you go a bit more into how would you secure that kind of solidarity?
Yes, I can speak about one or two of our proposals. First of all, because it is, there are provisions in our treaties. There should be, of course, enforced by not only politicians but also by judges. Now, coming to political pressure, we suggested, in line with some proposal from the Commission, just to think about budgetary retaliation for countries that are not prepared to be so in solidarity with the others. There is another point that is raised in the latest letter from Emmanuel Macron, that is to think about a reshaping of Schengen. That is, you can't have, this is for countries that are not prepared to have a common asylum policy, you can't have the advantages of Schengen without having the solidarity in the asylum policy. I think that is something that it is probably difficult to be heard in certain countries, but it is also a point that should be made.
Karen?
Yes, it's difficult.
But you mentioned something very interesting, that at the grassroots levels, at the regional, below the toxic national level, it actually appears to be working somewhere.
Yes, exactly. So we see a lot of cities signing pledges that they want to relocate people, that they want to receive people. So there is kind of a grassroots willingness to cooperate. I also thought that the proposal from Macron this morning was really interesting. I've always thought about that, you know, because I've also seen Schengen, it's just the other side of the coin of our asylum system, and as long as our asylum system isn't harmonized, you know, how do you align those things? But yes, I think looking at the grassroots kind of solidarity movement is a first step, and like I said, maybe working with a few countries first, seeing how it works. But even now, if we look at the Mediterranean arrivals, the tough negotiations last summer, every time there was a ship to talk to Malta, Spain, France, every time trying to come to an agreement, I think we need to get these countries on board, but then we also, other countries need to show real commitment. And as I said, there is very little political space. Maybe after the European elections, we will see a bit of an opening. We can only be hopeful.
Yes, hopefully.
I'm just tempted to ask the question, given the national elections that happened in Europe, you're still hopeful for the after-European elections?
I don't know.
Good question.
The gentleman here had a question.
From DEFCO, talking on my own behalf. Let's face it, in the end it's always about budget, about available resources, about political making choices. And there we as DEFCO, we try to do development cooperation and try to find a solution for the root causes, for migration and people seeking asylum. Where do you think the balance should be? Should there be kind of a shift towards more making camps to accept refugees in a good way, or should we more focus on development cooperation and get that solidarity from member states and the population to helping people in order that they don't need to flee?
Or maybe it also raises the broad issue of Syria, the European policy towards Syria.
I'm not sure I completely agree with your idea of we should enforce more development cooperation, but that deals with migrations on the whole. We focused in here with asylum seekers which flee their countries because of the war or because of personal persecution. And naturally, and the highest figures concern Syria. And it's not mainly, in Syria, it's really a question of political situation and of the uprising of civil society and so on. You know the story. So it's not directly linked to an economic problem of underdevelopment. And of course, we can discuss the situation of North Sudan or Southern Sudan, where it's really very poor countries. But we are still very, we also wanted to defend asylum as a personal right. So there's, you understand in what sense I don't fully agree with your point.
Can I make a point to this? I think we should be mindful that development aid isn't entirely geared at keeping people where they are. I think development aid we should look at the needs of the countries and look also at more things than development aid, also look at trade and all the other things that make countries grow and make countries better places, also safety, for instance, being number one. And I think there are also different budgets for different things. You have a budget for humanitarian and first displacement, sort of. I know that it's all getting a bit blurred right now, and I'm following the NDICI negotiations as well a little bit. But I think what we need to protect our development funds as well a little bit from the whole migration narrative. There's already a 10% benchmark proposed in the NDICI, which border management is also ODA-able, to be very technical. So we need to really track what is going on there. So while I just feel like it should be an and story. We can focus on root causes. And I mean, we made a report on why children stay in high migrating communities, not migrating to the EU, but just migrating in general. And the solution to that is development oriented. It's having more than one meal a day or being able to complete your secondary education. So I think we should focus on both, but we should really be mindful that our development budget isn't only aimed at stopping migration.
Yes, I fully agree with that. And I don't want to preempt what will be in the next report, but Marc-Olivier already spoke about migration diplomacy, which is something we are calling for, because it is a clear necessity for the EU to have this kind of integrated policy, integrated diplomacy that will work with different tools, and development aid for development is one of them. Probably commercial agreement can be other. Probably military protection agreements can also be used for that. This is just to look at the complete set of tools that is at the disposal of the EU, that is not used at the EU level because mainly of national, would say national sovereignty, and that we have in the coming years and decades, just to put together, to articulate together, not totally to unify, but to make sure that it is working in the same direction and consistently. I think that is one of our big stakes for the future.
Thank you.
Still.
There was a lady in the front.
Yes, thank you. I'm Erika Schulze. I work in the Secretariat of the Libe Committee of the European Parliament. Yes, first I wanted to say what I'm always astonished about is that this connection between border control and asylum, because that you control your border better does not mean that, or should not mean that people cannot apply for asylum. So this is, I think, a very strange connection that has been established in recent years. But what I wanted to ask you with regard to your study is that the Parliament, in its position on the Dublin recast, is also proposing to abolish the first entry criterion and establishes a system with a limited choice for applicants. One of the critics of this is that it is said that if Europe would have such a distribution system, this would act as a pull factor and even more people would come. So I was wondering if you had thought about this, or if you had encountered similar arguments in your discussions. But that brings, I think, at the same time another issue a bit to the forefront, which is the question: how should the refugees arrive in Europe, because the way how they arrived in 2015 was certainly not the best way. That first they had to take a tiny boat to get on a Greek island where many of them drowned. Then they had to walk from Greece basically to Austria or to Germany to find a safe place in Europe, because this I can maybe say quickly here, Greece did not have an asylum system, and they did what they have done regardless of the Dublin regulation. All the time they give the people a paper, leave Greece in 4 weeks, and the people just disappeared. So my question is, did you think about these two issues, about this question of the pull factor, if you have this distribution system where the applicant can choose, and then this question of how can the people possibly arrive in a safer way if they are looking for asylum?
Maybe I can say a word on the first argument. Pull factor, of course, is always is one of the most frequent arguments, especially in the French context. The Ministry of Interior is permanently bringing up this argument, pull factor, which is not convincing at all, I think, because we're talking again about asylum seekers which are entitled to have a personal review of their situation. So it's not, we're not talking about collective moves, but about personal rights. So I don't see how if we treat people better, it doesn't change their personal situation. So I'm really not convinced by that, and it's also quite cynical, and at least in the French context again, quite cynical and ineffective, because our policy is to treat as bad as possible asylum seekers to avoid this pull factor, and it's not working at all, because people who are coming from Sudan,
we're not competing with the Assad regime.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not successful in this competition, fortunately.
So, well, that's the point. Yeah.
And sorry, I mentioned the pull and push factors, but from the economic point of view, for the migrants, what I meant to say, not for the asylum seeker, but for the migrants, is oftentimes migrants come because there is an offer of a job. That's what I was referring to as a pull factor. There is a healthy offer of a job, there's an overheating maybe economy, and the domestic supply of labor is not coping, and people arrive, take temporarily those jobs. It's very cyclical, it's very visible in the crisis, for example, in Spain, when the Latin American migrants left because there were no more jobs, and therefore Spanish unemployment was not as high, it's already high, but it was not as high, thanks actually to that buffer factor, and it worked very well in that specific case. But so there was a very different pull and push factors.
If I can add a word, I think, of course, I fully agree with that Marc-Olivier said. But probably the most important pull factor is the absence of independent process of decision and the absence of harmonization of law, and the absence of EU integrated process for the instruction of the asylum application. If you consider that there is just an individual right to protect, ruled by treaties, national rules, managed by independent authorities under the control of course, independent judges, there will be no pull factor. The main pull factor is the opacity of the system, the fact that there is no harmonization of the legislation. In some countries, you have to wait 3 months just to access the labor market. In others, it is 6-9 months. Of course, this is a kind of rule that the illegal immigrants and, of course, the illegal, what's the name again of the migrants helper, illegal migrants helper. So, smugglers. Exactly. They are playing with that. And a common integrated EU policy should put an end to that.
Karen.
Well, I think we should differentiate between what is a pull factor between European member states and what is a pull factor maybe generally to the EU. I don't know, and I've thought about this just now because I haven't really thought about it before, but we have this new system with migration liaison officers which are being sent out to third countries. It might be worth thinking of having asylum liaison officers in embassies in third countries which could check or verify eligibility for asylum. That would at least ensure a bit of a safer way to arrive to Europe maybe, and it could also be an initial buffer to say, well, looking at your situation, you will have absolutely no possibility to enter the EU. Maybe this is a utopic proposal, I don't know, I haven't really thought about it, but it would be good to have the embassies involved and the EU representations involved in third countries maybe to give some more accurate information. And I thought about that because I met someone in Agadez who said that before migrating he had been to the Italian representation 3 times in Senegal, and they always refused him and he didn't get any information, and in the end he decided to migrate. So there might be a role there for them.
Please.
Yes, hello. I'm from the liaison office of the Bundestag. Talking about the pull factors between the member states, I think this should also be seen in context with the principle of solidarity and equal sharing of responsibilities, because since we have these pull factors, if the asylum seekers can decide themselves in which country they want to apply, there is this unequal share. And how do you want to tackle that as long as there is no harmonization? Thank you.
Well, that's precisely one of our proposal. Maybe you will complete if I'm not completely correct, but the idea is that there should be some kind of harmonization and equilibrium between the countries, and that would be specifically one role of this European agency, which will look closely at the situation in each countries, the applications, and redistribute among the countries when there's obviously excess in a place and some places in other countries. So that's the role of the agency. But then each country has to process with the application.
We had a working lunch with the German ambassador in Paris. He explained us, or tried to explain us, about part of the German system. That is, asylum seekers that are to some extent assigned to a land. They have the right to go in another one, but without any help. And this is a system that can be efficient. You know, if you want to go to France or to Italy, of course, we will see through the asylum authority if it is correct in terms of solidarity. At the end of the process, you will be assigned to a given country. You can accept that or refuse that. But if you receive that, don't ask for any subvention, any help in any kind. That's what we have been explained about the German system. I'm not a specialist in that, but also I think it could be something efficient at the EU level.
And also, that, as you mentioned in the report, that it might also help, the cost of integration might decrease, although it's less visible to a politician. If the migrant seeker can choose a place where they might have better chances of integrating. In a case of redistribution, I think some of the, Latvia has taken some migrants, almost none of them stayed in Latvia. They're not so bad compared to others in terms of compliance, but in the end of the day, nobody stayed because the environment domestically was so hostile that they couldn't rent an apartment, nobody would rent them an apartment, they couldn't find any jobs, so the people picked up and left.
And of course, what Marc-Olivier mentioned about the minimum level of rights that is granted to asylum seekers should be, of course, harmonized, because there is no way out of that, of course.
Maybe we'll take one last question, coming towards the end. Two, but two at the same time.
student here in Brussels. And I wanted to ask, what is your suggestion with people who are refused, who are not given asylum, and because there's a problem in countries like in Germany, for example, where people just burn their passport or they injure themselves and then they can't be sent back to their countries. So if you really want, I mean, you suffer, the conditions are bad, but if you really want, you can stay in Europe somehow, even though you're refused. And so what's your solution to that problem?
Maybe we can take all together and
exactly,
just make a global response. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Lars-Erik Fjellström, and I work for the Swedish Permanent Representation, and I'm actually dealing with the whole asylum package except Dublin in the negotiations. I mean, it's an interesting report, I have to say, but I have to agree with the Save the Children that politically I don't really see any moving forward on most of the suggestions that you have, because the problem is the same as we have right now. But I have a question about the harmonization that you're talking about. What's the price for harmonization? What would it be? Because the problem right now is in harmonization is that if we would harmonize in all EU member states, it would mean that probably half would have to diminish the rights of asylum seekers. So is that the price that we should pay? Or should we, because we could never reach the higher level if we want harmonization. It would have to be a lower level. And I mean, that's what we are fighting in, I mean, for the Swedish perspective, we understand that if we want harmonization, it would be less rights than we have it right now. Thank you.
Is there a third question? No? No. First of all, just to be straightforward, if we don't make any differentiation between persons that have asylum granted and persons that have their application rejected, we can't save the asylum right. That's a point that I think everybody will agree with. Now, this doesn't mean that we should not respect, comply with human dignity and good treatment of the people. But as Marc-Olivier said, and he will probably elaborate on that, we need to have some kind of readmission agreement with the origin countries where the EU should play a higher level of involvement and then should play a most important role than leaving every single country dealing with the country of origin, which with some countries is really difficult. Just think about the relation between France and Algeria, for example. I think it's much better to have the EU taking that in charge than leaving France negotiate bilaterally with Algeria. Now, coming to to be clear on the response, of course, if some asylum seeker has its application rejected and has no right on the labor legal migration or the family legal migration to stay, it should be just sent back to the country of origin. Yes, that's unfortunately the system. Now, regarding the political, I would say, reasonability of our proposal. One of our proposals is to say that probably it is not time to expect an agreement with 27 countries, but maybe it's time to think to an agreement between a set of countries, among which probably the Mediterranean countries, probably Germany, of course, maybe also the Benelux, if they are happy to share that, and to say, okay, we are in this type of closed circle, we renounce to the Dublin system, and we are putting in place between us a different system, just to show that it may work. That's an idea, of course, but we agree that we don't see a way to have an adoption of a completely different system in the coming months, of course.
Yes, I gladly want to reply to that question about returns. Yes, it is a problem. We've actually written a report not so long ago about children that have been returned to Afghanistan, where we followed around 60 children that were returned from several European countries, including Sweden, to Afghanistan, and we asked them also, of course, firstly, I have to say, as if the children, we do not think sending children back to Afghanistan right now is a good idea. We don't support it. But we also asked them what they would need in order to want to return and in order to be able to return. And I think the most important thing is that they can envision their return, that they can see it, that they can see, okay, I will be moving back to this community, this is my school, this is my house, this is my environment, and have a concrete reintegration plan. That really helps. And we're also working with a lot of governments to collect best practices. And for instance, the UK has a family return panel where they work together with families. And in the beginning, they're a bit hesitant. And of course, the initial reflex of a lot of people is to go underground and to disappear. But the case management approach, where you work together with families and kind of prepare them for their departure, they get some financial incentives, and they kind of really can see what is happening to them in their country of origin, that has really helped. And I am a strong proponent of voluntary return because forced return is very difficult, and if you also look at it, in many European member states, voluntary return is the only thing that really works. And not to mention Sweden again, but I know that there were a lot of people from Iraq that just voluntarily chose to return, and that was then the most effective. So I think if you want to make sure that people that cannot have a right to stay here, and that they return effectively, that could be one step. But of course we shouldn't forget that, and that's also a point that you raised, one of the most important obstacles to return is third country cooperation, is third countries not recognizing their own citizens or don't want to cooperate, even refusing flights to land in their countries with returnees. So there's a lot of practical obstacles there. Another thing also that was in the report that I liked is even if someone is a rejected asylum seeker, it might be worth looking at which other regular pathways they could have to stay in a country. I know a Sudanese boy in Belgium that was refused asylum, but then he is now working as a chef, and a chef is kind of a profession of which we don't have enough, so now he will have the right of residency here, and he's already working. So there are several ways to look at this issue, I think. And then in terms of harmonization, I didn't write a report, but I would of course support a harmonization according to the Swedish model, pre-emergency and temporary laws. That's what we as Save the Children would stand for, no?
Just maybe to add a very rapid word on harmonization, I think the key propositions that we make is first, harmonization is independence of the procedure and the judge who decides for asylum, and which is not necessarily a new cost for countries. It's more an administrative decision to give independence to the agencies that in each country are in charge of this. And the second point, which is really key, is the authorization to get on the labor market quickly. And it doesn't imply any cost, as I see it. So, of course, on the rest, I agree with you. Probably that the Swedish situation is better than elsewhere. But on these two key points, I think it's not an impossible challenge.
And there are plenty of EU directives that are putting in place a minimum harmonization without, of course, prohibiting a country to have higher standards, which is probably something we can think about.
Last question, and then we're closing.
Okay.
Just go ahead.
I'll ask you to that, Michael. The elections have been mentioned and the possible negative outcome, and also the lack of political pressure or the political reluctance, basically. So basically this is asking for the citizens' approval and citizen support. What kind of communication do you think is needed to create that awareness, and who should be, perhaps together, should be responsible for that communication?
According to my own experience, if you take time to explain the difference between asylum right and migration, it is much easier to have kind of support from the persons you are meeting with. But this is an important point, and I think this is probably a priority at the level of the EU for the next election, to say and to explain people what we are doing is to try to save the asylum right in the EU, not to put in place right now, even if we think that it should be done at a moment or later, but to protect the asylum right, which is part of our values and part of the values that are at the origin of the EU construction.
Yes, yes, I think, well, I've been to so many meetings about framing and communication and how to communicate a message. I think what we need to realize is that people are reluctant to listen to experts, and what we now try to Save the Children in our communication is to let, for instance, guardians speak about what their experience is with asylum-seeking children. We let foster parents speak about their experience, and neighbors, etc. So that generates a little more trust for other citizens. And what I also think we need is a strong defense and a narrative on why we want to safeguard the right to asylum in the EU, because that is really the question I am also confronted with a lot. Like, why in the EU? Why should we be playing that part? Why can't other countries play that part? And I think we really need to think about that with these upcoming elections.
On this hopeful note about winning hearts and minds, thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much for the panelists. I hope to see you next time, especially on the migration report when it comes out.
With pleasure.